All right. Jim Gordon, good to be with you. Thanks for making the time.
It's good to be with you, Jeff.
So I will say your book, Transforming Trauma, I want to stick it in every top drawer of every night table at every Motel 8 in the world because it has become, over the past week, my new Bible. And I so deeply appreciate you writing it. And I hope that we can unpack a lot of the components to it because there's a lot of subjects to hover over. But I thought I'd start where you start, both in the book and in the course that we collaborated on, with the dispelling of two primary misconceptions about trauma. And this is obviously the work that you've dedicated the majority of your life to. And I found these eye-opening right away, because there is a mythology that trauma is exclusively reserved for those living in the most immiserated, war-torn, or impoverished areas. And I think you do a great job at dispelling that is not a pathology reserved for some people. And then the second piece is that if you have been traumatized, then you're just permanently scarred. So perhaps as a means to kick off the conversation, you can tell us how you've begun to understand the nature of trauma in all of its expressions and address some of these mythologies.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. And that is the way I started the book, started Transforming Trauma, because I think it's really important that all of us understand that trauma is a part of life and not apart from it. The idea that trauma, which is a Greek word that means injury to the body, mind, or spirit, just comes, as you suggested, to those people who've been horribly abused or those people who are in the middle of wars, that's a very narrow and, I would venture to say, a modern notion. Indigenous people all over the planet understand that trauma comes to all of us sooner or later, and not infrequently. And so that they have developed ways of helping everyone in the community deal with the trauma. And I think if we transpose that to the modern world and we just take a look at our own lives, if we just reflect on our own lives and the lives of people we know, it becomes clear that some people suffer trauma early in life. Those children who grow up in poverty or violence, not even if their parents are kind to them and good to them, they're still living in a world where there are tremendous threats every day. You think about, kids who don't know and parents who don't know if there's going to be enough food on the table, and how anxiety provoking, how traumatic that is. Or little children who have to walk to school with gangs threatening them. It's brutal. It is traumatizing. Or the kids who have serious illnesses when they're small, either hereditary or illnesses that have take them when they're small children. So that's traumatic. In young adulthood or midlife, most of us suffer trauma, whether or not we recognize it that way. At my 25th reunion at Harvard Medical School, I decided with the people who were planning the program that I'd talk about trauma. And I thought, well, what was the first trauma that I was aware of? And I realized it was my first year at Harvard Medical School. I was I'm wondering, what am I doing here? I mean, I'd loved college. I went to Harvard College. I had a great time. It was a wonderful place to exercise my intellect, my imagination. Medical school felt so rigid and regimented. The people were brilliant. Professors were brilliant. I didn't know who I was anymore. I was really kind of disoriented by the whole experience. And afterwards, what was so interesting is that in the course of my talk, I said, you guys, to my classmates, you all looked like you had it together. Afterwards, I would say a quarter to a third of my class came up to me and shook their heads and said, no, I just looked like I had it together. I was in worse shape than you were. So or a breakup of a relationship, a serious relationship, is devastating. And in midlife, over half of American marriages end in divorce. I have yet to see a divorce that was not traumatic. As we get a bit older, of course, our parents, grandparents die or become seriously ill. That is traumatizing. And then if we don't experience trauma then, surely if we're fortunate enough to grow old, we experience it as we deal with physical frailty, with the inevitable loss of people we love. My brother died, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, died of COVID-19, as best I can tell. And we have to deal with our own impending death. So trauma is a part of life. And that is, on the one hand, it's perhaps threatening, but it's also reassuring that this is not something so extraordinary, and also that there's no way to deal with it, and also that it is expectable. And so when it comes, we shouldn't be quite so shocked. We shouldn't be quite so surprised. So that's number one. And the second point that I make and that you made when you introduced me is that once we've been traumatized, that it's going to last the rest of our lives. Now, it is true that early trauma makes us more vulnerable to later trauma. And some of that, or much of it, is on a biological level. There are changes sometimes in our chromosomes, there are changes in our physiology, changes in our psychology, which make us more vulnerable to not only to the same kind of trauma, but to other kinds of trauma. That is true. On the other hand, there are tools and techniques that we can learn, that anyone can learn, that can bring us back into balance after we've been significantly thrown off balance psychologically and physiologically and socially and spiritually by trauma. We can come into balance, and in fact, we can become more healthy and whole than we ever have been. We're not relegated to a kind of dustbin or ash heap of continual unhappiness and lifelong psychotherapy or medication. No, not at all. That this path through and beyond trauma to what we're now calling post-traumatic growth is one that just about all of us can take. And that's why I wrote Transforming Trauma, and why I'm giving this course, is to give people guidance on this path of hope and healing.
Yeah, and it's so important because we're not really taught anywhere else how to deal with trauma or with grief. Certainly, this is not a course I remember taking in high school or in college. And I think that's why this emerging field of work is so important. And there's a couple things that you touched on there that I want to unpack, because as you articulate, trauma will inevitably occur in our lives. I think for children, and I have three, children are particularly susceptible to trauma, or recurring patterns of stress associated with trauma can hit children in a particular way because they are still developing. And I wonder if you can, because you've done so much work with children over time, and they may be a little bit less able to apply some of the tools. So how do you think about children and addressing kind of traumatic events with them?
You're absolutely right. The children, because of their developing brains, their developing social relations, they are more vulnerable to trauma. And the traumatic events, whether it's a war or a divorce or parents who are fighting all the time or major disappointment, they affect brain development more significantly in children. That's a reality, if you will. That's the bad news. The good news, though, is that children's brains are more plastic, they're more flexible, they're more adaptable. And in fact, children can learn the techniques that I teach in Transforming Trauma better and faster than most adults. And because they don't have the sense that they cannot use their imagination. They
Mm.
don't have the inhibition, for example, about moving their bodies that adults do. So they're able to pick up on the techniques if they're taught to the kids in a way that's interesting and fun and engaging. They learn very fast and they can move through trauma quite quickly. And this is especially true of children who come from homes that are, as the physician Winnicott said, with not a good enough mother, a good enough father, a good enough home, average homes where they're taken care of. Then with that background, when a traumatic event happens, like the pandemic, they can move through it much more quickly and they can learn these techniques very quickly. I think the difficulty for the children who have the real difficulty are the ones who are being traumatized by their parents,
Yeah.
where the trauma is overwhelming and inescapable, and where they're actually being betrayed by the people on whom they depend. Those kids have ongoing trauma that is much more difficult to reverse.
Yeah. And just the continuity of that trauma makes it very, very difficult to escape. And one thing that you say really rings true, just because I do have children, so I have everyday anecdotal experience with it, that they are more apt to be vulnerable than a lot of my contemporaries. We don't like to share our stories. We feel inhibited about that. We feel a sense of shame associated with that. But at least my children feel a lot more open about sharing story. And in sharing story, people can see their own story in someone else's and they feel less alone. It seems like it is a way to process trauma and stress. I wonder, just that idea, that notion of sharing story, is that helpful?
Absolutely crucial. All of us who've worked in the field of psychological trauma for a number of years understand the vital importance of being able to share your experience with others. So the program that I teach is a program we can do in transforming trauma, in the course and in the book is a program we can do on our own. And we add so much to it when we share what we're going through with others. And you're right, I think kids have that, it's easier, they're less self-conscious. We live in such a horribly self-conscious society. I've spent time with indigenous people and I'm smiling as I'm talking to you. Our listeners can't hear it, or maybe they can hear me laugh a little because I'm thinking about some of the people I've spent time with. Every day they share with each other what's going on, often at breakfast. They would sit together, the women would sit together, the men would sit together, the teenage kids would sit together. What was your night like? How are things going with your husband? Have any dreams? How are your kids? So they get in the habit of sharing what's going on, which is so healthy. And I think that that's something that's missing in our society. And it's so beneficial in general for living fuller, richer lives and being more connected to each other. And it's especially important if we're going through some kind of traumatic experience.
Yeah, it's funny. Before we started recording, you were asking me about how COVID had affected or impacted my life more physically, but my response was actually a little bit different, which is, we've established ritual in our family that was not there prior to COVID. I live in LA and my kids are very active and busy and they're doing all sorts of wonderful things. But oftentimes in the evening, we're just like scattered leaves. And during COVID, we we really grounded into a ritual of having dinner together every night. And that seems like a very old-fashioned kind of concept. Um, but it was really, really helpful because we would go around the table every night and really share. We have a kind of a silly game called Rosebud Thorn, where rose is you share the best part of the day, bud is you share something that was maybe had potential, but hasn't really manifested yet. And thorn is the thorn that's stuck into your side on that particular day. And we would just do that almost de facto every night. And it was a really great way to just be in connection and alleviate the stress that at least my children had by with the isolation they felt and the lack of social contact that they had over the time.
Or some of your kids teenagers?
Yeah,
And
16.
they were willing to do it.
They were willing to do it. Yeah, yeah. Well,
That's
just
great.
once it becomes a ritual, it loses all of the all of the window dressing of shame or embarrassment or whatever it happens to be.
It's beautiful. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that they're willing to talk about the thorns. Because often in many households, kids will just talk about, what went okay, or they'll just say everything's fine, kind of. That's
right.
Especially when they're teenagers, that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
But the invitation to talk about what's painful is really important, and that's the beginning of trauma healing. Mm-hmm. Is understanding that something is going on, that something is happening here, and that it is causing some distress, and even if you don't completely understand what it is, of at least being able to share what you understand. And that then there's something that you can work with. Then you can use all these tools and techniques. They make sense because you say, oh yeah, something is happening to me. Just yesterday, I was seeing a patient who, like those of us who are white collar people and able to work at home, he's been able to work at home. But I took his pulse was pounding. He said he's fine. I took his pulse and I said, your pulse is kind of fast and it's kind of pounding. He said, it's true. He said, I felt a lot better after the election and after the inauguration, but still, this is Washington, D.C. after all. He said, but still, you're right. I am feeling tense. I am concerned. I'm concerned about my daughter. I'm concerned about when we're going to be able to travel again. I'm getting older. I'd like to be able to go places. So, but he didn't even completely realize what was going on. So I think that we need to tune into what's actually happening the way you're giving your kids the opportunity to do, and then share it. The other thing we can do that I want to mention right here is it's great to share with other people, but you can also write it down in a journal. And I don't know if you've been keeping a journal during this time, but when you keep a journal, and I teach this in the course, when you keep a journal and you write down what you're feeling, what you're going through, that in itself lowers your level of stress and lowers stress hormones and improves your mood. And there's been wonderful research done on it. And it's so simple, just 15 or 20 minutes a day of writing will do it.
Yeah, well, I have been keeping a very public journal. I publish a 2,500 word sort of unveiling of me and my family life every Sunday, and I connect my email to it actually, and it's been just really an unbelievable connective experience and growth experience for me to share the stories with other people and then get the influx that crests my inbox every Sunday and Monday. And it's really been a huge part of getting through this time. I want to address many of the tools and modalities that you have developed to address trauma. But before we do that, because those tools and modalities emerged often directly from the biological causes of trauma, I wonder if you can take some time to discuss the biochemistry or the biology of trauma, and maybe get at the basic kind of fight and flight response that is ancient and designed to be protective, but modern life has evolved since we've roamed the Serengeti. So maybe you can unpack a little bit of that biology.
And and I hope nobody is intimidated by the word biology or by the science. It's very simple, basically. When we are threatened, and this response, the fight or flight response that you mentioned, has evolved over millions of years, quite literally. It's there in all vertebrates. Fish have it. Every animal with a backbone has fight or flight. And it's a response that was developed evolutionarily to deal with a predator. And it's what enables us to either escape a predator, a threat, or to fight against it. And whether we escape or fight is largely determined biologically. I'm sorry, it is determined biologically, but it's determined genetically. So it's built into our genes and our chromosomes. Now, fight or flight is meant, as you suggest again, it's meant to be quickly turned on and quickly turned off. A classic example is that we have seen, perhaps on a video or a movie, is of an antelope that is happily grazing on maybe on the Serengeti plain in Africa or at a water hole. A lion comes along and boom, the whole herd of antelopes is running as fast as they possibly can away from the lion. And they have gone into flight. They're in the fight or flight response, but their genetic programming tells them, you don't fight a lion, you get out of there. So what's happening with the antelope? What's happening is blood pressure is going up, heart rate is going up, the big muscles in the body, the ones that enable the antelope to flee, are activated, and digestion is shut down. The whole focus is on life-saving, getting out of Dodge. So in humans, the same thing happens, except we go into fight or flight, not just from physical threats, but from emotional threats. So it's not just, being worried that somebody's going to beat us up on the street, but if we start to become apprehensive, are we going to get COVID-19? We can go into fight or flight. What's going to happen to my job afterwards? How am I going to deal with my kids who are home and screaming and not wanting to look at the screen on which school is coming to them? We go into fight or flight. And what happens with humans is that this whole panoply, because of these large brains that we have, of reactions and responses follow. So we get more irritable, for example. We're staying in that state of fight or flight. Activity in the amygdala, that's amygdala, which means almond in Greek. It's an almond-shaped portion of the emotional brain that's responsible for fear and anger. Activity there goes up. So it's firing away that fear and anger center. Meanwhile, our body, our blood pressure is up, our heart rate is up. We may have stomach problems because digestion's kind of shutting down, and we may feel tension in our body because we're in fight or flight, but we're not running away. We're just sitting in front of our screen or yelling at our kids or whatever we're doing. And the part of our brain that's responsible for thoughtful decision-making and self-awareness and compassion, the part of our frontal part of the cerebral cortex that's responsible for that, is a bit shut down. So that's why we wind up being irritable and not able to concentrate and have difficulty sleeping, and all of those come because fight or flight, which is meant to be turned on quickly, as it is with the antelope, and turned off quickly, as it is with the antelope, hangs around. So in us humans. So the antelope, 2 minutes after its escape from the lion, if you look at the pictures on the Nature Channel or anywhere else, the antelope is happily grazing or drinking water. Fight or flight has come, it's done its job, and it's turned off. So digestion is once again on. The antelope looks placid. It's not wide-eyed, and it's back in balance. We humans tend to carry the lion around with us long after the lion has disappeared. So this is what causes post-traumatic stress. Something has happened to us that's traumatizing, whether it's a divorce, a loss of someone we've loved, an experience of violence on the street that happened some time ago. We carry around the images of that. We have nightmares about it. We carry it around in our body and continue to be more or less in a state of fight or flight. Also, if the stress is ongoing, as it is in the pandemic, and I mentioned my patient who came to me, he's sort of gotten used to being in a state of fight or flight. So he had to be reminded of it. The other reaction that comes when we're dealing with trauma, when the trauma is overwhelming and inescapable and fight or flight can't operate, we can't get away, we can't fight, is the freeze response. And the example that I like to give, because I saw it many times, is of the mouse who is caught by the cat. And what happens, I don't know if you have cats that catch mice where you live.
We do.
Is the mouse is in the cat's jaw, and sometimes the mouse is dead because the cat has chomped down on it. But often the mouse is still alive and she's kind of hanging limply from the jaws of the cat. And often enough, at least my cats got bored. The mouse wasn't fighting back. So they put the mouse down on the ground, and the mousie shakes herself off and runs off to the mouse hole. So the freeze response, the shutdown, the kind of constriction and collapse of the body, putting out endorphins to numb the pain. That's come, it's done its job, and it's gone. In we humans, where the freeze response continues because the overwhelming stress and trauma continue, like with children who've been abused, seriously abused, or for some people during the pandemic, people will say, I'm exhausted. Often those people are in a kind of state of being frozen. And what happens in that state is that we put out endorphins to numb ourselves to the pain. And we often take a distance, a kind of psychological distance from the pain and even from ourselves. This can happen, the freeze response can happen when the trauma is continuous and feels overwhelming, as it does for some of us during COVID-19, or when we have experienced an overwhelming traumatic event and we continue to replay it in our mind. As far as we know, the mouse has no memory of being in the cat's jaw, but we remember what happened to us, and it comes back to us in our nightmares and in our dreams. And I've worked a lot, for example, with people who've been tortured in other countries by dictators. And what they say is when they were traumatized, and I've worked a lot with people who've been raped and people who've been sexually abused. And they say that when it happened, and you can read this in the accounts of women who are coming out publicly, they sometimes will say, I froze, I shut down, I didn't know what to do. And what they did is they kind of shut down, they kind of were maybe hunched over or closed off. Psychologically, they took a distance and they were like numb and unable to speak, unable to protest because they were in a state of freezing. The people who are tortured, where the trauma is so overwhelming, the ones I've spoken to will say, I left my body. I was on the ceiling watching the torture being done, and I didn't feel the pain. And what you see continuing, whether it's women who've been sexually abused or people who've been tortured, is that many of them continue in that frozen state, sometimes exhausted or much more tired than you would expect them to be, and shut off emotionally from other people and chronically mistrustful. And they have a sense that the mistrust came from these traumatizing events, but they don't know what to do. And they keep themselves apart from other people because they're so afraid that the same thing is going to happen again, and they just don't trust anymore. So those are the two basic biological responses. And the work in our Commune course and in the book, Transforming Trauma, it begins with helping everyone to create antidotes to the fight or flight response and to the freeze response, and to come back into physiological and psychological balance. And the techniques are pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and pretty easy for anybody to do.
Well, thank you. And I want to jump into those techniques. I think there's a few things that I'd just love to hover over just for a moment before we dive in. One is this notion of I think it's, you call it disassociation or dissociation, right? Which is this disconnection that we have from our thoughts and feelings and memories that can linger.
And from our body.
And from our body. And it's interesting because, and I don't know if this actually plays into any legitimate theory, but I've seen, for example, possums play dead and they go into freeze mode.
Exactly.
But when they then move out of threat or out of danger, they shake. And it's almost as if somatically they're removing the stress from their body. And animals seem to be able to have that ability. But we humans, and this may be the double-edged sword of consciousness, manage to bring those memories along with us. Sometimes we seem to suppress them, and other times, we can avail ourselves of the tools that you provide to more adequately process them and literally somatically remove them from our body. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, how stress gets stuck, and maybe even as a addendum to that, talk a little bit about the gut, because this was one part of your book that I found absolutely fascinating, enlightening, mind-blowing, around how trauma disrupts digestion and leads to intestinal permeability and inflammation that can then have begin this cycle of having continued detrimental impacts on the brain and the nervous system. So
Sure.
I know that was a lot.
And it makes sense to tie those together because trauma affects every cell in our body. There's continual communication among all the organs and cells in our body. So when we're traumatized, both the fight or flight and freeze response directly or indirectly affects every single physiological function. Now, as you say, when a possum playing possum, that is a form of freezing. It's like the mouse. The possum gets all the credit, but mice can do it too. The mice is frozen. And also what happens is there so that even when an animal doesn't go into full-blown freeze response, which is the last-ditch survival response, when an animal has been in fight or flight, it will also, after that crisis is over, it will shake itself off. So if you walk your dog meets another dog, they're growling at each other or biting each other, whatever they're doing. After it's over, often the dog will shake itself as well. So the shaking is a way of climbing back into a kind of higher state of physical and psychological balance. And it's there in just about all animals that I at least land-dwelling animals. I can't speak to the amphibians and the fish, but I've seen it pretty much in all land-dwelling animals that I've noticed. In humans, the same is also true. The shaking of the body can also help to free us from both the agitation of fight or flight and the shutdown of the freeze response. And some indigenous people are wise enough to know and use this. The best known are the Kalahari Bushmen, who regularly shake their bodies. It's a part of hygiene. It's a part of staying in balance, just the way we may go to the gym or work out on a bicycle or go for a walk. They shake their bodies regularly. And this is very much a part of the program of trauma healing that I teach in Transforming Trauma. And it's become increasingly accepted, increasingly widely accepted by many people in the psychotherapeutic community. Peter Levine is somebody whose name is associated with this and has done very good work with this. But this is not something that should be looked at in isolation. This should be part of everyone's program of trauma healing without exception. And it's not, I'm not deprecating in any way either the meditation techniques I teach or the guided imagery or nutrition, which we'll come to, or self-expression, connecting with others, and I would say, or psychotherapy for that matter, but working with the body, giving us an opportunity to shake loose the trauma that's lodged in our bodies and giving our bodies a chance to express themselves needs to be a fundamental part of our healing from trauma and of our keeping ourselves in balance in an ongoing way. Now, moving on to the other question that you raise about the effects of trauma on our gastrointestinal tract and what we can do about them. There's a whole chapter, and it happens to be the longest chapter in Transforming Trauma, which is about the trauma healing diet. And this is very important. And it is neglected by 95%, maybe more, of therapists who work with trauma. And it's a very serious mistake, because what happens when we're traumatized is that every aspect of digestion, from what the gastroenterologists or the nutritionists would call the cephalic phase. Cephalic is a fancy Greek word for head. The thinking part of food, the way we think about food, the way we make food choices, that's disrupted. We eat, so we're drawn to comfort food because we know from experience it relaxes us, it quiets us down, makes us feel a little more peaceful, a little bit happier. And it does. The problem is that a short-term relief and a short-term benefit, if you keep on eating a lot of comfort food, it's going to cause all the long-term problems we know about. Too much sugar and salty food and fatty food will cause hypertension and diabetes and make us anxious and make us depressed in the long run. So that's food choices. But we also eat fast. So we're swallowing air and our stomach can't do the job it's meant to do. We're also interfering with our small intestine, where most of our nutrients are absorbed. And we're interfering with that in several ways. One of them, I'll just mention two of them. One of them is that the cells that line the small intestine, they're called endothelial cells, are normally very tightly packed together. They have what's called tight junctions. When we're under stress, the cells tend to separate, and parts of our food that are not meant to go into our bloodstream, that are meant to be further digested, cross these loose junctions, go into our bloodstream, and can cause inflammatory reactions everywhere in our body, including in our brain. And one of the molecules that's most often seen and the biggest culprit is gluten. So even if we're not sensitive to gluten before we're really stressed out, we may well become sensitive. This doesn't mean we have celiac disease. It means these tight junctions have opened up and gluten molecules that don't belong in our bloodstream, that don't belong in our joints or our brain, are leaking out and going everywhere in our body and can cause everything from what we call arthritis to what we call depression or anxiety, depending on where they go. Another disruption that regularly happens with chronic stress and trauma is in the microbiome. And in the last few years, it's become we've become much more familiar with the microbiome, which is a word for the trillions of bacteria that inhabit our intestine, small intestine and large intestine. When we're under chronic stress, when we've been traumatized, to simplify a bit, the good bacteria are suppressed. There get to be fewer of them. the bad bacteria multiply. And this is not just a matter of academic interest. When that happens, the messages that the vagus nerve, which goes to and from our digestive tract, the messages the vagus nerve brings back to the brain are compromised. The vagus nerve is responsible as the antidote to the fight or flight response. Also, the vagus nerve, when it's working effectively, helps the brain rebuild itself after trauma and stress. The vagus nerve activity is inhibited and diminished when the microbiome is out of balance. And so the brain that has already been stressed out and traumatized, and as I said earlier, the parts of the brain that need to rebuild themselves don't have the ability to easily do it because of what's happening in our intestine. So, all of which is to say that part of trauma healing is eating a diet that is essentially a healthy diet. And there are many different kinds of healthy diets. And you can read about it in Transforming Trauma. And there are lots of other books. It could be a vegetarian, could be vegan, could be a diet that includes, that is an omnivore's diet, including many different kinds of food. As long as you're eating a diet that's as unprocessed as possible, as balanced with vegetables and fiber and fruits, as well as protein and fats, healthy fats. Eating a healthy diet and adding some basic supplements like omega-3 fatty acids that are in fish oil or flaxseed oil. Adding some probiotics, that is, those are the good bacteria that are in our intestine, making sure we're not deficient in vitamin D3, which is really important for dealing with stress, and adding a multivitamin, multimineral. Just even those basic hints, and I go into this much more in Transforming Trauma, can help to bring us back into balance so that we can deal with the stress we have experienced, and it makes us more resilient to deal with whatever stress may come to us later on.
Yeah, thank you for that. I certainly that impulse to sprint to the cabinet and reach for comfort food is tantalizing when we're experiencing some degree of stress. And I think that has not been uncommon, for example, during COVID, where in people's uncertainty and maybe there's not as much stuff to do out in the world, they can run to the refrigerator or the freezer and, pull out that pint of Haagen-Dazs and
Sure.
spend too much time in front of Netflix,
but that
devouring it.
There's we don't do that because we're dopes. We do it because it does decrease our level of cortisol, the major stress hormone. It
Right.
increases the level of serotonin. It calms us down. It increases endorphins so we don't feel the anxiety and the pain so much. The crucial thing, there are two pieces here. First of all, or three really. One is understand that when you're going for comfort food, understand that it's understandable.
Yeah.
There's a reason why you're doing it. That's number one. Number two, experiment with having 3 tablespoons of Haagen-Dazs and not 3 pints or 1 pint. And see what happens. If you eat it slowly and mindfully, and we do teach this very much in the course, if you can eat slowly and mindfully, it's okay, and you will be satisfied. I can attest to this. Eating 3 tablespoons, which is not my nature. I'm somebody who really loves to eat. But I eat those 3 tablespoons and I do feel calmer. I do feel more relaxed. I'm getting the benefit. And then the third point is have compassion for yourself. If you do binge, if you do eat that whole pint or even a quart, just remember, okay, I did it. Maybe I don't have to do it next time. Next time, let me experiment with 3 tablespoons full instead.
Yeah. And also, to your earlier point, eating slowly allows your body to develop or generate the enzymes that will allow you to digest the food properly so it doesn't actually rot and ferment in your gut and cause further issue.
Right. And also, if you eat it slowly, if you generally eat more slowly, then there's time for your stomach to say, hey, buddy, I've had enough. You may be eating because you're anxious, but I'm here to tell you, I'm your stomach, and I'm here to tell you it's enough. If we eat so fast, there's no time for the stomach to give us those signals.
Yeah. And the last bit on diet before we move into some of the other tools, and you point this out eloquently in the book, is that you don't need to have endless disposable income to eat well. And oftentimes, you know, the whole paycheck or the availing of good, high quality food has been cubbied, you know, for the affluent, for people that just can afford, you know, to spend endless disposable income on food. And certainly there is a disparity within our country and of course around the world around accessibility to healthy food. But you also suggest some ways that people can eat well without spending a tremendous amount of money. And I think that that's important because if we're going to address trauma, we need to make that available to everybody.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very important point, Jeff. I think it is true that if you have more money and if you live in an affluent neighborhood, it's much easier than if you don't have as much money and you live in the food deserts that so many people who don't have a high income live in. That it's so much easier. However, we've been working in communities that where people don't have much disposable income for many, many years. And so we've developed ways of helping people to think through how they can get healthier food and how they can prepare it in a way that's delicious and good for them. So everyone can do it. It requires some education and requires some effort for all of us. I mean, basic idea is if you're fortunate enough to live in a place where fresh food is available, and that's a bit of an if, and that's really hard. Some of these food deserts where people live, or for example, on Indian reservations where we've worked, where it's bloody hard to get healthy food. So you have to really put out a lot of effort. However, the sort of ground rules are where eat whole foods. Don't eat the processed food. And cook from scratch. So there's a lot of things. I mean, there are recipes that are there on our website, the Center for Mind Body Medicine website, cmbm.org. And pretty soon we're going to be coming out with a whole course that we've developed for a hospital system that we want to make widely available. Mm-hmm. But get as much whole food, as much fresh food as you possibly can. And also, it doesn't have to be the most beautiful food. It's possible to eat those things that they put out and they say, well, these are a couple days old and they don't look as beautiful. That's why they're lowering the price to half price or less. They taste perfectly good. And it's a matter of beginning to use a little ingenuity with cooking and starting to use some spices, starting to use herbs. One of the things is we've forgotten what our ancestors knew about cooking. Even when I was growing up, whatever it was, 70 years ago, when I was a kid and I was growing up, everything was cooked every day. We went to the store, got fresh food and cooked it. That was, it was a well-to-do neighborhood, but everywhere in New York at that time, there were stores selling food. So, and now you've got to find a place. There are ways, there are collaboratives, there are cooperatives that are springing up all over. There are farmers markets. those are places I would go, and I would stock up on food. There are a lot of foods that can be preserved perfectly well if you put them in the refrigerator or you keep them in a dark place. During the pandemic, I've only been shopping every 3 or 4 weeks. And occasionally my potatoes start sprouting a little bit after during that time, but they taste okay. I'm here.
Sweet potatoes, right?
Yeah, sweet potatoes are a bit easier. And so, and then some of the guidance about that eating in a healthy, inexpensive way is there in the chapter on a trauma healing diet. But I think what we have to remember is we don't need to have some of the foods that we're accustomed to having. We don't need to have, we eat so much more meat, for example, than we need to have. And we can cut down on that and therefore cut down on some of the expense. We can move in a healthier direction, move and then say, chicken is pretty inexpensive. And, we can get chicken and we can prepare chicken in a variety of ways. Some fish, for example, fish like mussels are very good for us and they're very inexpensive. Most of the rich people don't want to eat mussels anyway, so mussels are pretty cheap still. So you can find interesting ways to cook them. Some fish is not terribly expensive. Eggs are a good source of protein and they're not so expensive. It doesn't have to be beef and pork all the time.
Right, yeah. I read a number of times how you stress the importance of omega-3s and its relationship to depression and stress. And certainly fish is a good, proper source of omega-3s.
Fish is a beautiful source, best source. And populations where they're bigger fish eaters have a lower incidence of depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I will, before we move on from the mindful eating piece, I will say one of the pieces that I found really, really helpful in the book is almost this cheat sheet of organic foods versus non-organic foods, and that some fruits and vegetables are grown with so many pesticides, and oftentimes crops are sprayed with glyphosate and other agents that undermine the nutritional value and obviously erode the soil and have all sorts of other deleterious impacts. But there are some fruits and vegetables that, if you can't afford to buy all organic, that seem to be less impacted by pesticides and being grown in a non-organic fashion. And I'll put those in. I'll put those two lists in the show notes, because I thought it was
the lists. The lists are there in Transforming Trauma. I have the environmental working group to thank for that. So they have the latest updates on their website about what you can safely eat and not. But in Transforming Trauma, it's there. That information is there and available to everyone.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other tools for managing stress, particularly different forms of meditation that you leverage in working with people.
Sure. Well, essentially, meditation is essential. Meditation comes from the same Sanskrit and Greek root word as medicine. And it means to take the measure of and to care for. And indigenous people, as well as the practitioners of the high classical healing systems of medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, the Greek Hippocratic medicine, from which our own modern medicine comes, they all understood that meditation was essential to maintaining good health. Because meditation is what brings us into balance. Physiologically, psychologically, it makes it easier for us to relate to connect with, to bond with, to appreciate other people. There are 3 different types of meditation. There are thousands of techniques, and none is any better or any worse than any other. And if anybody tells you this is the one you have to do and only this one, head in the other direction would be my suggestion. That's dogma. That's not wisdom.
Right.
These different meditation techniques were developed at different times, in different places, by different societies to meet different needs and concerns. There are, however, three basic categories. There's concentrative meditation, focusing on a sound or an image. Concentrative meditations are part of all the world's major religious and spiritual traditions. So you could be mantra meditation. Mantra means sound in Sanskrit, focusing on a sound. Could be focusing on an image. You could focus on looking at the ocean, or indeed looking at a video or a picture of the ocean. That's a concentrated meditation. Repetitive prayers like Our Father, or Illallahu Illallah, or Shema Yisrael, or Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Repetitive prayers are technically concentrated meditations. As far as we know, they're 7,000 to 8,000 years old. They may be older. Next kind is mindfulness meditation. We're talking about mindful eating. Simply eating slowly and becoming aware of thoughts, feelings, sensations as they arise. This, as far as we know, mindfulness comes from Siddhartha Gautama, who became the man we call the Buddha, the man who woke up. And this is about 2,500 years ago. And he said, this is my method. My method is becoming aware. Mindfulness, vipassana, again, is the Sanskrit name. The third kind of meditation is the oldest kind on the planet. All indigenous people do this, and these are expressive meditations, and they are fast, deep breathing, the shaking and dancing that I teach in the course, that I teach in Transforming Trauma in the book, makes use of that shaking response that we were talking about earlier, that is the natural response of animals when they're dealing with a situation that's been overwhelming, that's caused fight or flight or caused freeze, but also adding to that a time for the body to just express itself freely. So the shaking begins, shaking loose, the tension, the shut down body, bringing energy into the body, and then a couple minutes of slow, deep breathing and being aware of what's happening with the breath in the body, and then movement to music that energizes and inspires us. So that's a 3-stage expressive meditation. So all of those are useful, and all of those are part of the program and the course of Transforming Trauma. And again, it's not that any one is better. They're all useful in different ways for different aspects of the trauma we've experienced or the stress we're undergoing.
Mm. Yeah, and there is also a link between these meditative practices and emptying the mind such that creative expression can emerge. And I know that this is another component of what you teach, of being able to facilitate the connections between the potentially traumatized and emotional part of the brain and the more expressive part of the brain. And that connection can sometimes become clogged, or and so you often employ exercises such as drawing exercises or guided imagery. And I wonder if you could talk about those and the nature of them a little bit.
Sure. Basic idea is, I want to sort of start at the sort of foundation, is creating some physical and psychological balance so we can make use of these innate capacities that we have, of our imagination, our intuition, our capacity to express ourselves, as well as our innate intelligence. If we're in a state of fight or flight, we're in a life-threatening situation. This is no time to, sit down and read Shakespeare, or for that matter, express ourselves in words to other people, or draw what's coming to our imagination. So we bring ourselves into balance, And then we can use all these tools so much more effectively. And so the ones that we use in the course that I teach in the book, Transforming Trauma, include what we were talking about earlier, writing in a journal, expressing ourselves to other people, using drawings to bypass the conscious censorship that sometimes comes with words, and to just see what comes out on the page when we draw ourselves, or draw ourselves with our biggest problem, or draw ourselves with our problem solved. Allowing us to move freely so that we can express ourselves with our bodies, using written exercises. And there's one I teach, a dialogue with a symptom, problem, or issue, which mobilizes our intuition and our imagination to help us look at things in a fresh way, not in a purely rational way, but in an intuitive, imaginative way. Or guided imagery, guided mental imagery, which can help us draw on the vast reservoirs of wisdom that we have inside us that normally most of us don't access. But if we can get into a place of relaxation and calm and quiet, we can open up our minds to the deep inner knowing that we have that can help us solve problems that have been frustrating us. And so I teach the safe place and wise guide imagery in the course and in Transforming Trauma so that people can make these tools a part of their daily life. I use these tools of the imagination regularly. Whenever, when I'm wondering about a difficult situation, maybe there's a difficult situation at work, a decision I have to make in my personal life, I calm myself down, I quiet myself with soft belly breathing, and then I go to a place that feels safe or comfortable in my imagination. And once I'm in that place, I let a guide come to me who's emerging from my imagination. It could be a person or an animal or a figure from scripture or a figure out of myths. And I have a dialogue. And it may sound strange to some of the people who are listening to us, but this is what people have done originally from the time that humans began. They would go to this intuitive place and they would get help with solving problems. Why shouldn't we make use of this incredible sort of reservoir of talent we have inside us with this great wise being that exists in every one of us that can answer these questions that vex our conscious mind. Yeah. So all of these tools and techniques, and there are about 15 or 20 that I teach, they're all useful. And you may like the wise guide imagery. Somebody else may like doing drawings. A third person may like doing a written dialogue with a symptom or a problem or issue. They all work. And the whole idea is for people to experiment with as many as they'd like, and then to see which ones work for you. Because we're all different from each other. And so the techniques that we prefer are going to be different.
Yeah. Well, circling back to the beginning of the conversation, when you were dispelling the second myth, which is that trauma scars us for life and there's no redemption and there's no resurrection and, we're doomed to this fate. Obviously, in your work, you have been able to leverage a lot of these practices and modalities that really dispel that notion completely. And I know that you've worked in virtually every corner of the world, right? From sub-Saharan Africa to Gaza and Israel, and working with the folks, in the aftermath of the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, or the school, and also after many of the fires that ravaged, California. And I wonder if you could articulate an example of this kind of redemption or this healing. Because I know right now, obviously, what just happened in Colorado with another mass shooting and people going through very acute trauma. And I think, again, to kind of go back to story, maybe you could ground this optimistic view of redemption in a story that you had firsthand or the experience with that can illustrate the power of utilizing these tools?
Sure. And as you say, I have worked during wars with people where the bombs are still falling. And I've worked with war traumatized veterans and war traumatized civilian populations. And after this Parkland school shooting, which you mentioned at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, and I don't know yet if we'll be working with the people in Colorado, but I know that I and my team at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine are working with people who were affected by, who were in the Capitol on January 6th. Mm. And so with both the police and the Congress people and the staff members and others. So I want to tell you a little story because I think it's illustrative about a congressman I'm working with. And he was in the gallery in the House of Representatives. And there were people, as probably everybody who's listening to us knows, there were people there who wanted to kill the Congress people in the Congress who were storming, they had weapons, they were bent on destruction. And he was in there, and he, like others, were terrified. And there were people who were texting family members and saying, I'm not sure I'm going to come out of this. They were being protected by Capitol Police who had their weapons drawn. It was a very, very scary situation. He was frozen afterwards. He said, I didn't realize, he said, I just shut down. I couldn't feel anything for 2 days. And then as I started to look at the images of what had happened, I became incredibly anxious. And he began to have anxiety attacks. So he couldn't get his breath. He was all tense. He was in pure fight or flight mode. He was irritable. He wasn't sleeping very well. He couldn't concentrate. He kept having replaying images. And every time he saw what had happened, he would be triggered and he would re-experience that. He would have anxiety attacks. So a mutual friend who's also a congressman suggested that he be in touch with me. And in the very first session, he was in a car. So I said, listen, I'm going to send you a copy of my book because I want you to start doing soft belly breathing. But I don't want you to close your eyes while you're driving in the car. But I want to tell you something. I want to tell you, you can come through this. And that's something that everybody who's listening to us needs to know. I have worked with people who have seen members of their family massacred, who have, not that they ever stopped grieving, not that they ever stopped sadness, not that it ever stopped being horrifying, but they have reclaimed their lives and have gone on to live full, productive and loving lives. So I say this at the beginning, as I said to this congressman, you can come through this. I've worked with thousands of people who have come through this. And there is a plan for doing this. And the beginning is, first of all, you recognizing what's happening to you, that this is a normal response to an utterly abnormal situation. You're not crazy. You don't need to take pills. You don't need to be in psychotherapy for the rest of your life. There are ways that I can teach you that will help you move through the situation. And what I'm going to provide you for a while is an opportunity to talk about what's going on. And I will teach you how to move through this situation successfully. So the next time we met, which was a couple of days later, when he wasn't driving, I'd sent him a copy of Transforming Trauma. I taught him soft belly breathing. And what I taught him was that we can do this just for a couple of minutes here, but I spent about 10 or 12 minutes with him And in the course in Commune, I teach this along with teaching all the physiology in 10 or 12 minutes. But just right here and now, we can slow down a bit, allow our breathing to deepen. Breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth with our belly soft and relaxed. And I said to the congressman, just as I'm saying to you and to everyone who's listening to us, this is a concentrated meditation. And I want you to focus on the breath, to concentrate on the breath coming in through the nose and out through the mouth, on your belly being soft and relaxed, and on the word soft as you breathe in, and belly as you breathe out. And as you do this, feel your whole body relaxing with each exhalation, with each breath out. Feel yourself relaxing a little bit more with each breath. Deepening this experience of relaxation, this concentrated meditation, by focusing on the breath coming in through your nose and out through your mouth, on your belly being soft and relaxed, and on the word soft as you breathe in, and belly as you breathe out. If thoughts come, as they will, let them come, notice them, and let them go. Gently bring your mind back to soft belly. Just a couple more slow, deep, soft belly breaths. Okay, open your eyes and let your attention come back in the room. How do you feel, Jeff?
I feel great. I'm not sure I can continue to perform my role as podcast host, but I do feel relaxed.
Great. And so did the congressman.
Good.
And that was
Because
first
that's
time.
more important than my role.
Oh, both of you important. Everybody's important. But this,
yeah.
For him, it was the beginning. He saw he could, just as you are, that you can make a difference. You can make a difference in how you feel. So one of the terrible things about his trauma, and trauma for all of us, is we often feel we can't do anything about it and it's never going to change. So he saw in that session, I can make a difference. And maybe, as I suggested to him, and as his mind had already registered, because the mind works this way, if I can make a difference in one way with one technique, maybe I can make a difference with other techniques. So he began to do the soft belly breathing, 10 minutes sometimes, 3 minutes sometimes, 4 minutes sometimes, doing it regularly every day. And he started to feel some freedom from his anxiety. When we talked about, he said, well, yeah, but what if it happens again? What if I really get all tensed up? And how do I keep that from happening? And what do I do if that happens? I said, if that happens and you can't sit still, that's when shaking and dancing comes in. So I taught him how to, this second visit, he was in my office. And we got up and I showed him how to shake and dance, just as I do in the course in Commune, just as I teach in in Transforming Trauma. So we did shaking and dancing together. And now he said, that's great. I got it. You know, that's kind of weird, but it's great. So he started doing both of those. And after within a week or so more, he's never had another anxiety attack. He's come into balance. When he starts getting anxious, sometimes he'll do soft belly breathing. Sometimes he'll do shaking and dancing. He does soft belly breathing several times for a few minutes every day. Working in Congress is a high stress job. And so he's come into balance and he can deal with all the responsibilities that he has and deal with people who upset him. Because one of the things that happened is he got very angry at the other people in Congress who had egged on the rioters, who'd encouraged them. Yeah. And he's now found a way to deal with them in a much more balanced way, to be very straightforward about what happened and not to pretend that everything's okay, but not to just be yelling and screaming at them either. And this state of balance has made it possible for him to use many of the other techniques that I teach, including the wise guide technique, which was also extraordinarily important for him. So, and this is one story of one person among thousands. And this happened with, using a couple of techniques and coming into balance. And because he was more in balance, he could use the wise guide. He could use the other techniques so much more easily.
Yeah, well, this may be a new metric of success for your career now. If you turn on C-SPAN and you see the House chamber and people are shaking and dancing, then you've really done it. But that's a great story. And I know that you were very influenced by Frankl in your early career. And there was a quote that you mentioned in your book, which I believe is, suffering ceases to be suffering when it becomes meaning. And I am very, very grateful, as many others are, that you've dedicated your life to this work and helping people find that meaning and alleviating suffering. And it's just an honor to be with you. And I thank you deeply for this time and for your continued work. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this book has become just a mainstay in my life. It ties together so many different scattered thoughts that I've been thinking about and puts them into one place in a very accessible and brilliant way. So I thank you for that. And I thank you for working with us at Commune and trusting us. I've seen the first edits of the course, and it looks fantastic. And I hope that we can amplify your work so it continues to make impact in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I have to say, and I'm not just saying it because we're on the air, I'm saying it because it's true. It's been a joy to work with you and Megan and Jake and the whole team. It's really just a pleasure.
I'm Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune, where every week we explore the ideas, values, and practices that bring us together and help us live healthy and purpose-filled lives. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll join us.